Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming along to this Cabot Oceans Seminar on the future of the seabed. I'm Dr. Laurence Publicover. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Bristol, where I work on Renaissance literature and also anything to do with humans and oceans. So the structure of this today, this will last for an hour. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so to introduce, I guess, some of the ways that I come at this issue of the future of the seabed, and then I'll pass on to two colleagues, Kate Hendry and Tim Edmunds, who will introduce themselves. They'll speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A at the end. So there are sort of three interlinked things that I hope we'll end up covering and discussing in this seminar. One is simply why the seabed is such an interesting place, I think, to scientists, chemists, biologists, but also to lawyers, to people who work in, like Tim, in global security, to people who work on global economics, and also to literary historians and cultural historians. So that's the first thing. The second thing is why I think the seabed might become more significant to us, to humans, over the next few decades, now that we know more about it, and we're also in the position, because of technological advances, to exploit its resources more fully. I think the thing that we might particularly want to cover today is the issue of deep sea mining, which, for those of you not familiar with this practice, seems to be on the horizon in the next few years. Certainly, kind of, it's likely that the seabed is going to be mined for metals, for rare earth elements. And the argument made by those advocating this mining is that these metals, in particular cobalt, nickel, manganese, are necessary to develop a green economy, because we need these metals for things like batteries, for electric vehicles, in order to kind of develop a circular economy. That we don't currently have enough metals in the global economy to do the things we're going to have to do to transition to a greener economy. So this is the argument about which we might want to talk, that's being made for deep sea mining as a kind of green venture, if you like. But of course, there are all sorts of environmental implications, or perhaps more accurately, we know that there are environmental implications, but because of the relative paucity of our knowledge about the seabed, the implications are not entirely clear as to what deep sea mining would create. So yes, it might become more significant to us over the next few decades because of technological advances and because of resource scarcity as well. And finally, I think one of the things I hope we cover is why interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches to the seabed might be helpful or interesting in kind of weighing up some of these decisions we're going to have to make over the next couple of decades over how our relationship with the seabed is going to change. I'm going to begin with a quotation, the very opening, this is, of an article by a guy called Will Hilton, who writes, "Unless you were given to chronic anxiety or suffer from nihilistic despair, you probably haven't spent much time contemplating the bottom of the ocean." It's a bit troubling for me, because I suppose I've spent quite a lot of time contemplating the bottom of the ocean recently, as a few other people on this call. So, I mean, it's a bit, perhaps a bit of a silly start to what is actually a terrific piece of journalism, but I think it does help to begin address this issue that I want to spend a bit of time talking about over the next 20 minutes or less. That the deep ocean is weird, and more than that, that it's difficult to think about, difficult to think with, that there's even something a bit unnerving about it. And what Hilton does helpfully here, I think, is set up that relationship between the seabed and the human imagination in a way that's very interesting to me. So as someone who works within the arts and humanities in what is sometimes called the blue humanities, questions that principally interest me about the seabed are: what are human attitudes towards it? How are such attitudes transported across cultures and across time? Are they universal or otherwise? And where do they come from? And beyond this, and I imagine this is where everyone else might get more interested, I'm interested in how these attitudes shape as well as reflect material encounters with the seabed, and by extension, the composition of the seabed itself. So one way of focusing that question might be to ask, to what extent are artistic representations of the seabed in literature, for example, or in visual art, to what extent do they respond to actual physical encounters with the seabed? And to what extent might they somehow structure the nature or the extent of some such encounters? Or we might think about the language that we use to talk about, to describe the deep ocean. What does it tell us about our attitudes towards the seabed? For example, that the deepest parts of the ocean have been named Hadal depths, that is, named after the Greek underworld, Hades. Is this simply a name? What's in a name, as Juliet asked? There'll be more Shakespeare later. Or does it tell us something significant about how we view the deep ocean, however unconsciously, as, for example, a site that's essentially dead? I'll come later to this issue of the azoic hypothesis in the 19th century. Or that we think about it as something essentially inaccessible and beyond the human domain. I would submit that in ways that are far from straightforward, asking questions about language and about literature and culture can help us think about why we interact with the seabed as we do. But in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, I want to begin not with literary studies, but actually with geographical studies, or more specifically political geography, where there's recently been an interesting move towards trying to address and analyze what scholars deem our increasingly vertical world. So Stuart Eldon, a very eminent geographer, writes, "We all too often think of the spaces of geography as areas, not volumes. Territories are bordered, divided, and demarcated, but not understood in terms of height and depth." Stephen Graham, in his book Vertical, says something quite similar. Issues of the height and depth of buildings, borders, airspaces, orbits, subterranean resource grabs, vertical mobilities, underground structures have all been remarkably neglected because of the persistent flatness of geographical debates. So this is some geographers kind of thinking about their own discipline, but I think the ideas that they're getting at here are transferable to other disciplines as well, to cultural studies more generally. I mean, to get back to issues of language, I think it's interesting that the Latin altus means both high and deep, kind of bringing together the two ends of this sort of vertical axis, if you like. And it might, so some work in geographical studies might help us to think about, I suppose, the difficulty we have in contemplating things like deep sea mining, perhaps, because we're just not accustomed to thinking along this vertical axis, so they argue. There are some really quite practical consequences of this. I'm not asking you to read all the text on this slide. I put it up partly just to indicate how long this Article 76 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea goes on. But human attitudes towards the oceans are expressed in various ways in law, in the laws that are developed to try to accommodate and make sense of this fundamentally unruly space. Arguments about who gets to possess, govern, exploit the sea have gone on for about as long as anyone has thought about legal definitions, certainly back to the Roman period. And they become particularly pressing in the 17th century in periods of kind of oceanic voyages. And they extend to the entire oceans, not just the seabed. But issues around the seabed are perhaps especially interesting. I mean, the arrangement that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea eventually comes to is that there are such things as territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles away from a country's baseline. And then there's something called the exclusive economic zone, which extends for 200 nautical miles beyond a baseline. And this is the area that a nation state has the right to exploit. But the seabed is slightly different. You can exploit the seabed up to 200 nautical miles, but if your continental shelf extends beyond that, then you can claim it for a further 150 nautical miles. So when it comes to things like exploiting extracting metals or hydrocarbons, it's kind of treating, I guess, the seabed differently from the water column above it in a way that I think, again, indicates something about an attitude towards the seabed. Another question that I think I find particularly interesting in terms of kind of ownership of the seabed and how that's going to be regulated is that beyond these exclusive economic zones, you have something that is generally referred to as the area, that is the international seabed, one that doesn't fall within the exclusive economic zones of any nation state. And that has been designated by the United Nations as a global commons. And it's in writing that any exploitation of that space has to be for the common benefit of mankind, or as people now say, humankind. So deep sea mining, which is often, not always, but often going to be taking place on the high seas in these international waters, has to operate under that understanding. But exactly how that understanding is going to be operationalized, exactly what it means for deep sea mining to be for the common benefit of humankind is an immensely complicated question that we might get onto later. But just to sort of throw one thing out there, I mean, what it might mean, for example, is that states such as the Democratic Republic of Congo that are big land miners at the moment, for example, of cobalt, might have to have sort of money from the proceeds of deep sea mining transferred to them in recompense for the falling price of metal, for example. So it's immensely complicated. Okay. So as a scholar of literature, I'm especially concerned with how these deep spaces are not just difficult to think about, but sort of uncomfortable to think about, how thinking about deep spaces causes a kind of conceptual rupture for us almost. So Kim Peters, Phil Steinberg, and Elaine Stratford, in the introduction to their excellent book, Territory Beyond Terror, these are geographers again, argue that the growing political significance of sites such as airspace, the underground, the ocean, the seabed, talk of spaces notable for their indeterminacy, dynamism, and fluidity, which have heightened depth and are often difficult to apprehend, as we find them difficult to think with. And Rob McFarlane takes this even further in his recent book, Underland, where he writes that deep spaces are vital not only to the material structures of contemporary existence, but also to our memories, myths, and metaphors. Nonetheless, we are disinclined to recognize the underland's presence in our lives or to admit its disturbing forms to our imagination. And I put on the slide here a picture of a sinkhole, which I think kind of captures this sense of a sort of disturbing opening up of a vertical axis in an otherwise horizontal space. So I'm now going to get into something that's, I guess, a bit more literary, which is trying to think through some of these issues and our relationship to the seabed through this particular word, fathom, and kind of going to the Oxford English Dictionary to help us think about that. If you haven't spent an afternoon with the Oxford English Dictionary mining certain words, then you haven't lived. So it begins as a noun, and as a noun, the word fathom indicates a unit of length, one most commonly associated with the measurement of deep water. And the unit in question, 6 feet, derives from the wingspan of a relatively tall human, thus literally indicating what a human can get their arms around, as in the Old English definition, 1a. Then in the first half of the 17th century, the word begins to be used as a verb, meaning not only to measure depth, to fathom depth, but also to comprehend, as you can see from definitions moving from 4a to 4b. So the word sort of contains within it that association between the seabed and knowledge. In the 17th century, navigators would fathom the seabed, dropping a plummet into water to measure its depth and avoid running aground. And waters that were too deep to be reached by plummets in early modern navigation, those that would be off the continental shelves, were called fathomless. So when you talk about something being unfathomable, it's quite a technical navigational term that means something that can't be reached, but then it also has this extended metaphorical sense of something that can't be understood. So I find it interesting and suggestive that this word accommodates these different kinds of meanings. I said there'd be more Shakespeare. So this is probably the most famous instance of that word fathom in English literature. So don't worry if you don't know very much about The Tempest. All you need to know here is that the song that's in italics, sung by Ariel, a spirit, is sung to Ferdinand, who is the grieving son of Alonso, the King of Naples, who is believed to have drowned in a sea storm and to be on the seabed. So Ariel sings to Ferdinand, and because it's so short, I'm going to read it. I won't sing it. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones a coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So what can we make of Shakespeare's evocation of the seabed here and this use of the word fathom? Well, he's presenting the seabed as something that's essentially alien, that's rich and strange. The point, I suppose, of this lyric is that Ferdinand is supposed to recognize that his father is no longer accessible, is no longer part of the same world, and that he should therefore move on with his life. It's also presenting the seabed as something that accommodates and transforms whatever is cast into it. Whatever used to be eyes are now pearls, whatever used to be bones is now coral. The benthic environment has kind of taken over, transformed, overwhelmed whatever was thrown into it. And there are, I think, environmental implications to this. If we, as we often do in many cultures, there's a brilliant book by a woman called Kimberly Patton about this. Think of the sea as a kind of, a sort of bin, essentially, or a sort of a toilet in which we can just chuck whatever we don't want and it will be fine because the sea will kind of transform it. One of the interesting things about Shakespeare's lyric is that it's transformed itself, or sort of revisited by lots of other artists. I've selected here T.S. Eliot, who in The Wasteland comes back to this moment in The Tempest 4 times. I guess with my literary critic's hat on, I might want to say something about how Eliot's poem is itself really interested in transformation and kind of rejuvenation, and that's what this lyric is doing there. But I think, you know, with a kind of environmental humanities hat on, we might also think here about the fact that Shakespeare's vision of the sea is kind of reappearing 300 years later, despite the fact that so much deep ocean exploration has gone on in that 300 years. So by the time Eliot's writing, it's 50 years or so after the Challenger voyage, which is the first kind of great oceanographic voyage of 1872 to 76. And the deep ocean is actually becoming a site that's becoming explored. And yet, because of this intertextuality, this relationship between texts, here is Shakespeare's vision of the ocean appearing again. And this is something Kate and I have been talking about recently. You know, you can almost think of visions of the seabed kind of accumulating almost like sediment on the ocean floor, so that you have this kind of archive of visions of the seabed that are being carried through. So why does any of this matter? Why might a kind of cultural vision of the seabed affect the seabed itself, or kind of scientific approaches to it? And I'm quite sort of hesitant about making too many claims here because I'm not a scientist, I'm not even really a historian of science. But it does seem to me that there are some ways in which we might think of how wider cultural attitudes towards the seabed shape, inflect, at least hypotheses in scientific discourse about it. So a nice example here might be something I mentioned a moment ago, the azoic hypothesis, Edward Forbes in 1843. And Forbes argues that it isn't possible for life to exist below about 550 meters in water because of the compression that's involved there. And so everything below it is simply dead, as though in Hades, if you like, that there's no life down there. Of course, we now know this to be a long way from true. The viperfish that's on the slide here complaining about this hypothesis lives in depths of about 1 kilometer to 4 kilometers below the surface. Interestingly, one of the ways in which this azoic hypothesis was disproved was because of another kind of human venture with the seabed, which was the laying of telegraphic cables, which I think Tim might be talking about in a moment. In the Mediterranean, they were bringing up cables to repair them from much greater depths than 550 meters and finding that animals were attached to them. So this was evidence that surely stuff did live down there. So that's maybe just one example of where a sort of scientific theory can respond in some way or be shaped by a wider cultural attitude. Another example might be overfishing, of course, not so much to do with the seabed, but to do with the sea more generally. This sense that it's been difficult right up to the 20th century for some scientists, even biologists, you know, working in the fisheries, to accept that overfishing might happen, because the ocean is presented as so sublimely indifferent to human endeavor in a lot of literature and culture that it's just difficult to imagine that we could affect it. Okay. Just going to say, we're going to wrap up here, perhaps by saying something. I've been a bit pessimistic so far about the relationship between literature and culture and science. I think one way that perhaps literature might be more useful as we think about the seabed and human relations with it is that in a lot of cultural evocations of the seabed, there is a sense of time operating differently down there, that it's a space in which history kind of congeals. There are lots of lovely poems, particularly Caribbean poetry, that think of the seabed with all its shipwrecks as this kind of archive of history, or this site where you can kind of go back in time, or at least think differently about time, think of it as something less linear. And I guess what's useful about that, potentially, is that time does operate on scales that are not quite human in the very deep ocean. We've got, I mean, you know, the sorts of things that are the processes that are eventuating in some of the things that currently people want to mine have taken millions of years to put together. So, you know, this is not like chopping down a tree and planting another one. This is, and I guess the same is true of hydrocarbons. These are things that are not, that you can't regenerate, at least in kind of human timescales. So perhaps one way of kind of drawing attention to the potential dangers of deep sea mining is to point out through kind of some sort of poetic evocation of the deep ocean, just how unsuited we are perhaps to thinking about the timescales involved in that sort of process. Okay, so to finish, this is my last slide. I just want to start thinking about some of the ways in which these different approaches to the ocean, to the seabed, might intersect. So I'm currently reading a book called The Deep by Rivers Solomon, which is this sort of fantasy of that begins on the premise that pregnant Africans thrown overboard during the transatlantic slave trade gave birth to this different race of humans, who then are sort of half human, half fish. And I bring this up just because, I mean, one of the many ways in which we engage with the Atlantic seabed is as a site of memorial, as a graveyard for the many people, including the very many enslaved Africans who were thrown overboard and sort of and with their bodies ending up on the seabed. So that's one, I guess, kind of cultural lens through which we understand the Atlantic, which is relevant when we think of some of the other ways in which we engage with it, as, for example, a resource space or as a site for telecommunications. I think the seabed is claimed by a lot of different actors, is a point of interest for a lot of different nations and kind of interest groups within those nations. And we're going to have to think, now that we have greater access to it and the capacity to exploit it, about kind of how we value it and how we're going to make most use of it, I suppose, in the broader sense. But perhaps that's something we'll get to talking about in the Q&A. For now, I'm going to pass on to Kate Hendry.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Laurence. So my name is Kate Hendry. I work in the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Bristol, although having said that, I spend most of my time thinking about the oceans. So I'm a chemical oceanographer, and I really work at the interfaces between the ocean and other places. So at these interfaces, this is where we're going to have the most sensitivity to climate. This is where things will happen quickly and things will change. So I'm looking in particular at coastal regions, especially in the high latitudes, but also at the interface between the oceans and the seafloor. And hopefully I'll sort of portray some of the reasons why I'm interested in this particular environment. And I'm going to start off with this picture here. So this is just really to help me illustrate the complexity of the seafloor in a way, and also just because I think it's a really cool squid. So this is a still picture taken from nearly 1,000 meters depth. So going back to what Laurence said, clearly this environment is full of life. And this is just off the coast of Greenland. And you can see those sort of cauliflower shaped things, those are deep sea corals. Obviously you can see the squid there. But also if you look closely, you'll see that it looks a little bit like it's snowing. And this is what we call marine snow. And so this is where one of the main scientific disciplines, biology, comes into this. So in the surface waters, we have algae that lock up organic matter, lock up carbon into organic matter through photosynthesis. When those cells die, they sink, they clump together, and they form this marine snow, which then sinks to the seafloor. So understanding the biology there, how the larger critters feed on the algae, how that processes this marine snow, all those sort of processes are really important in understanding how that material gets to the seafloor. But that's not the end of it. Obviously, that's where lots of these deep sea organisms live. They feed off this organic matter that's raining down from the surface of the ocean. But also when these blobs of marine snow hit the sediments, they start building up, just like pages of a book. And that's not the end of it either. Some of that stuff will become buried, and this is really important for understanding carbon cycling, because some of that organic matter can be buried, locking that carbon away from the atmosphere. But it doesn't stop there. So chemistry kicks in at this point, so another discipline, and there are a huge number of chemical changes that happen in these shallow sediments too. And this can either help to maybe keep that carbon locked away, or it can maybe help it cycle back into the water column again. And it's not just carbon, it's other elements that are really important too. So key nutrients that will actually then eventually be cycled out of the sediments back into the water, where they can feed production again, feed biology again. And that's where I come in. In particular, that's where I specialize. And it's not just good things like nutrients. We can also think about what might be happening with things like pollutants. So man-made chemicals, so organic molecules that can stick around in the environment for thousands of years, heavy metals and other toxins. So the seafloor, like I say, it's this interface between the land and the ocean in a way, and it's highly sensitive to climate change. It's sensitive to physical processes. So there's another discipline that comes in. So changes in ocean current, changes in ocean temperature, all of these things will impact the biology and the chemistry that help the cycling of these processes along. Next slide, Laurence. Thank you. So how do we actually study the seafloor? So this is pretty much my bread and butter. This is a coring device being sent off from the side of a ship. And all those little tubes that you could see, plastic tubes, go down, stick into these sediments, and then get pulled back up again. Okay, next slide, please. And then this device will get brought back up onto the side of the ship. And you can see then all the scientists go frantic and start taking the cores and doing stuff with them. So you can see some of these pictures here. We might sample the sediments. We might suck out some of the fluids that you find in between the grains of mud and sand that have built up on the seafloor. And all of this we do to try and understand these biological and chemical processes that are responsible for the cycling of carbon and nutrients and pollutants. Next slide. And this I just wanted to end on, which is just going to sort of touch on the technology side of things. So not only do we have these fairly sort of crude devices now for just chucking something off the side of the boat and hoping for the best, you know, be it a trawl or a dredge or a box core, but we also now have autonomous vehicles. So this is a high definition video camera from a remotely operated vehicle, which we're not in the vehicle as scientists, we're on the ship, this is remotely operated, but we can see the video in real time. And very skilled pilots can manipulate the equipment on board, so you can see the manipulator arm there, and actually take sediment cores in situ. So we can actually see exactly on the seafloor where we've taken the sediments from. And we can use these devices for also doing things like habitat mapping, seeing these deep sea creatures in their own life form, in their own habitat. And this has really revolutionized the understanding of our science. I should say that this has actually been sped up 4 times. It's quite a slow process. So I'll leave it there. But just to sort of summarize it, the seafloor is fascinating. It's really complex. And the reason I love studying it is because it brings together all these scientific disciplines. But because it's complex, I've also begun to really realize that it's helpful to engage with other disciplines outside of science to help communicate to people who need to know about the importance of the seafloor. It's a strange place, it's a complex place, so help me communicate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. I guess that means I'm up next. So I'm Tim Edmunds. I'm Professor of International Security in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies here at the University of Bristol. I'm also Director of our Global Insecurity Centre and co-director of the Safe Seas Network on Maritime Security, which, if you're interested, you can find out more about at www.safeseas.net. So in my comments, I want to bounce off some of the things Laurence said in his opening remarks. And particularly around, to start with, this idea about the ways in which we see the sea and we see the seabed. And Laurence mentioned that when we talk about the seabed, we're talking about something that's difficult to think about, that's difficult to apprehend, that's alien, that's rich and strange. And there are a number of dimensions, of course, as to why this might be the case. But one of those dimensions is simply that it takes place at sea. It takes place. It's part of the oceans. It's a maritime invisibility, if you like. And quoting Philip Steinberg, who I think Laurence also mentioned, Steinberg suggests that the political, geographical, and social space of the sea can be set against that of the land as a kind of a space beyond geography, a space beyond society. One that is indifferent to human endeavour. which in one sense is a sort of an intuitively familiar notion, but it's one that's also ignores the fact or plays down the fact that the sea is absolutely critical to the way in which we live our lives. 90 to 95% of global trade travels by sea. In terms of food security, around 3 billion people are reliant on fish for at least 15% of their protein. The sea has been critical to the rise of empire, to migration processes, in war, and so on and so on. So the sea is central. But when we talk about the seabed, there's a double invisibility there, because we're talking about what's under the sea as well as just the sea itself. And yet the seabed too is part of our lives, increasingly so. It hosts various critical infrastructures, communications cables, pipelines of various types and so on, the sinews of how we live our lives today. It's subject potentially to, well, it is subject to resource exploitation, and the deep seas potentially too at some point may be subject to resource exploitation for oil, for gas, for minerals, and so on. So the seabed is at the heart of our communications and our economy. That it's an integral part of our everyday lives, even though we may not realize it. And so in that sense, it sort of almost represents a kind of invisible Anthropocene. It's a site of human and natural interaction, but one that we very rarely think about, or don't think about perhaps as much as we might. And there's an emblematic example of that I'd like to use, and that's in relation to communications cables, global data cables. And maybe you could share the slide that I put up, Laurence, to help me here. Communications cables, data cables, bring the seabed into our everyday lives in a really meaningful sense. One of the things we often forget about when we think about the internet, particularly, for example, is its physicality. The internet is a physical infrastructure. Internet, it is reliant on land-based data servers, but also on submarine cables. And you can see the map there of various submarine cable routes around the world. The backbone of the internet is physical, and it takes place beneath, and it's located beneath the seabed. So in that respect, 99% of all transoceanic digital communications, the internet, mobile phones, and so on, takes place through undersea cables, as well as an estimated $10 trillion worth of financial transactions daily. The seabed in this sense, and the cables that run through it, are critical to how we live our lives. Now that, of course, raises some interesting challenges of governance. One of those is a question of security. If it is so critical, then perhaps what the seabed and the cables that are on it are a security concern we should be thinking about in terms of threats to our communications infrastructure and the sinews of our economy. Now, whether that threat comes from hostile actors, such as states, or from organized criminal groups trying to extort governments and so on, or from accidents, the importance to the way we live our lives is clear. Now, in most cases, redundancy in the cable network means that the worst case security concerns surrounding cables are not so much of an issue for most countries, but they can be critical for smaller states, isolated states with a lack of capacity to fix cables, with a lack of redundancy in their networks. And an example of this is Tonga in 2019, where an accidental cut of the cable caused major economic damage because of the collapse of the internet and mobile phone of internet and mobile phone signals in the country. So damage to tourism and to hotel bookings and so on, flights and hotel bookings for 2 weeks. So we can see the dependence of a country like Tonga on a single cable in this respect. But it also presents, cables also present a regulatory problem. How do we protect and regulate a critical shared infrastructure, some of which is located in underneath the high seas in the area, as Laurence mentioned. Now, we do have some international regulatory and legal mechanisms under UNCLOS, under the International Cable Protection Committee, and in their own territorial seas, states themselves are responsible for regulating and protecting their cables. But there's often an implementation gap between aspirations in that respect and the legislation, the enforcement capacity and so on to actually make that happen. Cables also raise an important challenge of public and private governance. Most cables are privately owned. Facebook, Google, Microsoft and Amazon own more than half of the available cable bandwidth globally, and 4/5 of cable investment between 2018 and 2020 was from those companies. So I realize I'm getting towards the end of my time. So my final point that I want to lead into from that is a question, and that is who should benefit from the seabed? Clearly, there are geopolitical implications over control of the resources that the seabed, that can be accessed from the seabed, whether that's oil or whether that's minerals or whatever. And where there are overlapping claims to these spaces, as we perhaps can see in the South China Sea at the moment, there is the potential or the actuality of geopolitical competition. But this question of who benefits is not just a geopolitical one. It's also one that has blue justice allocations. The use of the seabed for one activity may deprive other users of the sea of the ways in which they've been making use of it previously. And one example here, for example, would be the use of or the introduction of oil and gas mining, for example, in ways that disrupt local fishing communities and the grounds in which they've been fishing in, a process that's sometimes called blue grabbing. And then finally, there is a tension between human usage of the seabed and of the marine environment more generally, and indeed the marine environment. Tensions in governance between drivers of environmental protection, of blue growth, and indeed of equitable uses. Equitable usage. So all this means that actually the seabed may be becoming more visible in the future as an issue of global governance, not just as a technical challenge, but also as an issue of security and governance and regulation. And these, I think, are novel challenges that we are only just beginning to get to grips with. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone very much for coming, and thanks to the panelists in particular for their contributions, and to Scott for chairing. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening.